One. Are we ready? We're trying something new tonight. So our speaker tonight is Rob Sheppard. He is the author, photographer of over 35 books. He's a well-known speaker and workshop leader, and he's editor-at-large for Outdoor Photographer magazine. He has written hundreds of articles about photography and nature, in addition to books that range from guides to photography, such as The Magic of Digital Nature Photography and The Magic of the Digital Landscape Photography. He has also written the National Geographic Field Guide to Digital Photography, books about Photoshop and Lightroom, including Top Tips Simplified, Adobe Photoshop Elements 10, and Lightroom Workflow videos. And we are very lucky that Rob has been involved with our Photographic Center for quite a few years, way back in Delray. And he comes every year to participate in our Photo Fusion event in January, as well as teach workshops. So please help me welcome Rob Sheppard.
Thank you. I have the microphone. Well, thank you very much, Madam. Minnesota, and I know I sound like an old person that is like, oh, I went to school and walked uphill both ways, but it was true. Is that I remember one January where the temperature never got above zero. And they've had it above zero this January, so it's not that bad. But it's still pretty bad at times when they've had these extreme wind chills. But at the time, and you guys have probably heard this too, is that it's like, oh, Florida, oh, it's that flat place with bugs and humidity, and it's just hot, there's nothing there. Well, when I first started coming down here and like Fatima said, to Delray Beach when the workshops were there. And then I also was doing some workshops in other parts of the state. And I'm, as somebody who is not just a nature photographer, it's also important to me to connect with the nature. And I'm not one to just come in and do stuff. I want to connect with the place. And so I'd start exploring. And at first, it was a few things. Then I started exploring more. And I started discovering what an amazing place Florida is. Florida may not have changes in altitude, but it has a lot of changes in terms of what the life is, the plant life, the vegetation, the ecosystems, the wildlife. I mean, it's an amazing, amazing place. And a lot of people don't appreciate that because, frankly, and I know you guys know this, if you drive out on any of the roads that cut across Florida and you don't get much altitude and you just have these bushes on the side. They might be bushes, they might be trees, and you can't see much. You have no idea of the diversity and the things that are here, and there's really some amazing things. So one of the things that I've been really thinking a lot about lately is this idea of photographing from the heart. And you'll see why I have titled this Daring to Photograph from the Heart. And I think this applies to anyone as a photographer, but also as we're looking at photography. I think that there has come something in recent years, and some of us in the class that I've been teaching this week, we're talking a little bit about this, is that we see something like Facebook or Instagram where people are trying to put on photographs that are trying to impress other people, trying to show how much technique they can do. That's not always from the heart. And I'm going to talk more about that. That's doing something else. It's creating a culture of sometimes a rather superficial photography. And photography has so much potential as a way of communicating, as a way of connecting with other people, that I think that can be a problem. So photographing from the heart is really placing the heart first, and in the heart, doing something deeper than just up in the head. And that when you do that, and I don't care whether an individual is a beginning photographer, a photographer that's photographed for years, a photographer that has lots of gear, a photographer that's using an iPhone, all of those things, where you're photographing from, a place inside you, is going to affect how those photographs come out. It's going to affect what you photograph, what we photograph is going to affect all of us. It's going to affect how we photograph because it affects our decisions that we make as photographers, and it affects the impact of our photographs on any audience. Now, audience, it could be an audience like this, it could be an audience for a publication, it can be an audience of just friends and family. But all of those things have an impact, and how we approach the photography makes a big difference. So from the head or heart, one of the things about nature photography, and this certainly applies to more than nature photography, but it is an issue with nature. Oh, you had a light you want to turn off? Okay. One of the things that we definitely have an issue with all types of photography is we have nature photography, we have people photography, and so forth. And one of the things that happens is that as you start thinking too much to the head, you start getting something like shoulds. Shoulds come from the head. It's like you get nature photography and people say, well, it should be this or it should be that. And I have seen this in very often. People start getting worried and they say, well, can I photograph like that? I say, sure you can. Well, I don't know if I should. Is that okay? Should it be this? Should it be that? So that can take you away from the heart because it puts it all up here, just thinking too much. And then two, if you're really photographing from the heart, sometimes are we photographing someone else's pictures? Because if you're photographing from the head, sometimes that's what's happening. Are you photographing someone else's beauty? I see that all the time with people that are posting a lot of stuff on Facebook. There's a lot of times, and particularly if I know some of the photographers, you can tell they're not necessarily doing it because they're saying, hey, this is really interesting. This is something I care about. This is something that I want to connect with. They're doing it because they know that people are going to go, wow, that's really cool. Let me give it an extra like. Rather than thinking more from the heart. Not saying that it's wrong to get that, but sometimes people get too concerned about those likes. How many likes do we get for a photo? And I've heard people start saying, I didn't get enough likes. Or why didn't anybody like that picture? Well, sometimes that isn't as important as maybe connecting with people in other ways. And sometimes when you connect with a person, it isn't always about whether they like or dislike the picture. It's about connection. And so sometimes likes, though, if you're thinking too much about the likes, or if a photographer is thinking too much about the likes, he or she is going to be photographing more from the head and not always going from a deeper place. A really common thing for photographers today is when they start thinking too much about, okay, do I have the right format? Do I have the right camera? Do I have the right lens? I get questions all the time about the camera. And I think cameras are important. And I'm not saying that the technology is not important because it can be important in order for a photographer to realize his or her vision of what it is that they're photographing from the heart. But sometimes the camera starts becoming more important. Somebody's more concerned about how many megapixels they have than maybe what the camera's actually producing. People start making value judgments before they ever see pictures. They say, well, I've got Canon 5D, I've got a Canon 5D Mark III, the latest one, and it's got a full frame sensor. It's like, okay, so what? If it helps you get a better picture, great, but if it doesn't, so what? Or somebody says, well, I have a Nikon D800 because it's got this huge amount of megapixels. It's just an amazing camera. You go, so what? Okay, what's it going to do that's going to get you what you need? You need something.
Actually, I got your desktop on there. Is that remote?
Oh, it's taking this one? Oh, okay, because I mean, I used the other, so I need to mirror it. I thought you're getting it from this one. What it's sending out there?
Yeah, it's got this.
Okay, I'll just switch that. So we have to switch it for their feed. So let me change that. And you should be fine now, and they're fine. Okay. Okay. So you've got but people start talking about that, and people, well, I have to have this lens, and I've heard this. It says, well, I've actually had people tell me this, that they say, I just have this little camera. It's not full frame. They really have this thing it's like I can't do it, and it's like, okay, are you be able to use it to create images that you care about? That are you able to do things that connect you? And a problem I see is when you sometimes see certain photographers. You got it now? It should be, because it's displaying correct on both now.
Well, let's see the presenter.
It's not showing the presenter for me.
Last second, is it running?
Yep. This is the first time that they've done this streaming, so I'm a guinea pig, and you're a guinea pig. You have to change the application. Well, but they have to see it. He's trying to get it to see it in a different place. You've got it there. Try the source here. Let's try the different source. It's okay now?
It's okay now?
So if I do this,
Yeah, what you got up there?
is that displaying right now? Okay, great. All right, so now we're set. So anyway, the cameras and stuff, I've really, and it's like, okay, you don't have to do that. I've heard people say, well, someday I'm going to graduate to a real camera and get a full frame 35 millimeter full frame. It's like, no, that's not a real camera anymore. They're all real cameras. And any certain technology can help you capture certain things, but it doesn't mean that that's going to help you photograph from the heart. And sometimes if you spend too much time thinking about that technology, you can lose things. And with all these questions that people say, are you getting the right likes? Are you getting the right format, the right lens, and so forth? So often what's missed, do you ever hear this? Do you have the right photograph? Okay, sometimes that's far more important than any of the other things. And when I hear photographers start spending too much time on gear, or technique, or stuff like that, I say, all right, are we missing what photography is really about? And that's the photograph, and especially the photograph that comes from the heart. Ansel Adams once said that the greatest satisfaction comes from the realization of your individual potential, perceiving something in your own way, and expressing it through adequate understanding of your tools. Now that's where the technology comes in, and where the gear, adequate understanding of your tools. But you notice he doesn't say absolutely supreme understanding of your tools. He says adequate understanding of your tools so that you can translate your individual potential, perceiving something in your own way. That gets personal, that gets coming from the heart. Photos from the head or the heart. Photographs from the head often come when the technique is imposed on a subject. I see this in black and white a lot. Because what happens is, somebody says, I want a black and white image. So they take a color image and they remove the color, and so now they say, I have a black and white photo. All that is doing is imposing a technique on a subject. The subject might not work well with black and white, or even if it does, removing color is not the same as good black and white photography. Good black and white photography is not about removing color. It's about translating the color into an interesting black and white image. And you start going deeper. And now there are lots of techniques. You could apply this to HDR photography, all sorts of things. But photographing from the heart is being open to connecting with that subject to find something unique and special. So in the case of this, of black and white, is looking at a different interpretation of that black and white. So that it's not just looking at it as an image that I'm going to just remove the color. How can I interpret that? How can I connect with that subject from the heart? Well, here's some ideas for photographing from the heart. One is a care and connection, caring more about the subject as the subject itself than simply as an object. I have seen this, and I've seen this with nature photographers, and I think it's kind of sad when somebody goes out and is only concerned about the subject as an object, something that they're going to capture and put it in their camera and say, okay, I've caught it now, and there's no underlying care. If you care about that subject as more than just an object, you start looking at it differently. This is a video. I'm going to play this for you. And I was at Death Valley a couple of years ago, and there was the first time I was in this area, and I keep looking back and forth. The projector is so blue. I tried making some correction to it, but I can't correct it enough. Somebody has to actually correct the projector. And Death Valley is definitely not that blue. At any rate, Death Valley, when I got there, I had been there before, but this time, for whatever reason, this big open spaces, and any of you have been to Death Valley, you'll know what it's like. It's these big open spaces with very little vegetation. And it's kind of intimidated. The road goes through, and you just kind of see this long distance. You're driving and driving. There's not much there. There's not much of human scale. It's more of this massive scale. And that's one thing that attracts a lot of people. I mean, it is very interesting. But for whatever reason, it was bothering me, and I just was having trouble connecting with the place. And for me, I need to connect with the place. So we went by this one little spot that has, it's called Salt Creek, and the Salt Creek has these pupfish in them. Now, pupfish are little fish. It's a desert fish. They're very small. They're about the size of a minnow. And as I was going up there, I thought, well, this could be really interesting, but I had no feeling that I was going to be able to see much. It's okay, there'll be these little fish, they're in this stream, they'll be spread out all over, you'll be lucky to catch a glimpse of them. Well, it turned out there's a boardwalk and there's just tons of them. And at the time I was there, it was during the mating season, and they're just all over, and it was just really fascinating. Well, I got so fascinated that I ended up spending a lot of time there and even went back a second time, because these little critters were fascinating because they brought in a sense, they've been there a very long time, and they have adapted to this environment. They have adapted to a very hot environment. They've adapted to a very salty environment, the water. These fish live in saltier, hotter water than any other fish. There are other desert pupfish than the one at Salt Creek, but all the desert pupfish are like this. So just to give you an idea, let's just play. Fascinating to me, and I got more involved in it, and caring and connecting, I think, really helps. This is a little native bee. Native bees are something that a lot of people don't realize are a very important part of our world. We're so aware of the European honeybee that is the common honeybee that you see all over, and it came from Europe. And the little native bees are different looking. That you see different ones at different times of year, and they're very important for pollination. And they're just fascinating. So, finding other things. What a photographer loves, I think, is important to really photograph from the heart. Because if you're not loving the subject and you're not loving the photo, then you're missing something as far as, because loving things comes from the heart. And loving the subject and loving the photo are both important. Sometimes people love the subject really, really, really a lot, and they don't think about the photo so much. So, they just get a camera and start shooting, and essentially end up with snapshots. And I know people that have very expensive cameras that say, well, if I get a more expensive camera, I'll get better pictures. Not necessarily. And you still got to be able to care about the photo, too. And the photo includes light, color, all sorts of things. Emotion. An emotion is always, it can be a part of a photograph, because without any emotion, and I'm talking about the emotion that the photographer has and the emotion the photographer puts into the photograph, why would anybody else care? Now, there's no guarantee if you're really emotional about a subject and care deeply about the subject that anybody else will, but I will guarantee that if you don't really care anything about the subject other than it just being an object to throw in a photograph, then other people won't care so much, because you're just not going to have the same type of connection. And I get a photograph like this. This is up in the Kissimmee State Prairie, or the state park, the Kissimmee Prairie up north of Lake Okeechobee. And what was interesting to me was this sky, this wonderful sky, and then the prairie area down below with the little bit of palms. And just the hint of palms tells you immediately this type of location. Without those palms, this could be anywhere. With the palms, you have a feeling, okay, that's Florida. That's really typical of certain parts of Florida. And the sky is too. The clouds that you get in Florida are fascinating. And that's why the emphasis on the fly, because this was something that just was so cool. This was emotion that I wanted to capture that. Here's a totally different place. It's up in Minnesota. I was in northern Minnesota a year ago photographing along Lake Superior, which is one of my favorite places in Minnesota. And the winter, obviously totally different. It's cold. Actually, this winter could be really interesting because the Lake Superior does get ice on it when it's cold enough. Last winter it was not cold enough to get ice on the lake itself, but you obviously got lots of lake along the shoreline. And there's this explosion of the water, but it's also, there's an emotion that comes because of getting in uptight, up close and personal with the subject matter. Sometimes photographers, you'll see photographers back off from the subject. They back off, they use it, they're just too far away, emotionally, mentally, and physically. And sometimes that just doesn't then connect with the viewer as well. Now here's where that technique comes in again. Appropriate technique. Technique helps communicate, and as you gain in technique, any photographer, as they learn technique, is able to control the photograph, to communicate. Technique is about connecting a photograph and its content with the viewer. If you have a really blurry picture so that the technique is not very good, you're not going to connect a viewer with the subject very well because they're going to be put off by the blur. If a photograph has really bad exposure, if it has any number of things, you have trouble. So some technique is important. And as you have certain types of techniques, some photographers will use certain types of techniques to help connect in really, really strong ways. One of the techniques that a lot of people are aware of today is HDR, or high dynamic range photography. Now, some people just use it as a technique, and there's not really much connection there. On the other hand, some of you have probably, if you've been to these talks before, I know Dan Burkholder has talked here before, and he's one who uses HDR to connect with his viewer. And you can see it. He's using it in a very, very specific way, very carefully. He's controlling that image, and that's what the technique can be all about. Adequate, as Ansel Adams talked about, appropriate, meaning appropriate to the subject matter and to your viewer, is important. And then mastering the craft of photography is important to better use the medium so that you can indeed communicate from the heart. A big problem we all run into as photographers, everybody does, and that's the problem of the critic. And this is not just the critic outside, it's also the critic inside. Everyone has that self-critic. Some people are able to tame it more than others. Some people have that self-critic constantly badgering them. And when a photographer has a self-critic constantly saying, well, you shouldn't do that, or you should be doing this, or you shouldn't shoot so low, you should compose this way, you should do that, what's your, and now this may sound funny, because I don't see any really young people here, and then some of you will know exactly what I mean, you'll start hearing voices from your parents. What would your father say? What would your mother say? Okay, my dad passed away 2 years, and occasionally I still hear, his voice telling me I should or shouldn't do certain things, and I'm going, wait a minute. What does that have to do with anything? That's a part of our mental, background, and we have to sometimes step up and say, wait, that's not appropriate. And it affects all of us as photographers, because one of the challenges we run into as photography is not like, it's not like a speed skating race in the Olympics. In a speed skating race, there's a time everybody starts, and there's a time everybody ends, and you know who won, because there's a time there that says they won. A downhill race, you know if they won or not, because they got down at a certain speed and they got down faster than anybody else. Okay, with photography, there are no such standards. So it's easy to start picking up critics that are saying, well, you shouldn't do that. People I know in camera clubs will start picking up critics. Well, gee, I don't know if I can do that, because if I did that, I won't get points in the next competition. It's like, yeah, but do you care? I don't mean do you care about that. Do you care about your photograph? Do you care about your subject? How can you express that? So that critic is, be careful. Now, one of the things, I love this quote, and some of you may be familiar with it. It comes from Teddy Roosevelt. And this is it comes to the problem of the critic. Teddy Roosevelt said, it is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. Okay, you could have done that better on that photograph. Oh, you stumbled because you didn't have the right lens, whatever. Then he continues, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is not effort without error and shortcomings, but who does actually strive to do the deed. Okay, that's important, because as photographers, if you're really photographing from the heart, you're out there striving valiantly, you're getting out, your face may not be marred by, sometimes it is marred by sweat and dust, but sometimes you try things and you come up short, and because you do sometimes make mistakes. But you strive to do that because this is someone who knows the great enthusiasm, the great devotion, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement. And that's important as a photographer, that picture's coming from the heart is that high achievement. And who at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly. His place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. And that's important. That's why, while daring greatly, that's about vulnerability. And to photograph from the heart is making you much more vulnerable. Because if you photograph from the head and you say, well, I have this camera. Okay, nobody can argue that you have that camera. I have so many megapixels. Nobody can argue about that. I used a Photoshop, and I know Photoshop really well. Nobody can argue with that. I used this certain lens, and I was really careful with my histogram, whatever, all the technique. No one can argue with any of that stuff. But you say, oh, I really thought it was cool to have the bird in the picture off to the side with his face facing out of the frame because it looked like the bird was about to leave. People go, oh, well, you shouldn't do that. You should always have a bird facing or something facing into the picture, because you're stepping out of the bounds of the things that are in the head, and you start going in, and you become very vulnerable. So vulnerability. This is something vulnerable for a lot of people. This is also very much a Florida landscape. The palm tree and then the little palms way down at the bottom, big sky, okay? There are a lot of people say, oh, I have to photograph with the rule of thirds. No, you don't. It's funny on the rule of thirds, though. A lot of people know this. There's nothing wrong with the rule of thirds, but there's a challenge with it. Some of you know what the rule of thirds is. It says that composition, you should put the horizon at the bottom third or the top thirds. It's part of the rule of thirds. And in that, the problem is, the real world doesn't necessarily fit the rule of thirds. What the real world does is what the camera is, and we are dealing with. The rule of thirds was designed for painters, sketchers, that type of artist. Okay, a painter has a blank canvas. Painter can put stuff wherever they want. They can fit the rule of thirds perfectly. We can't do that as photographers, so you have to start saying, what can I do? How does a scene express itself to me as a photographer? But that makes you vulnerable if all of a sudden you're going to go against what everybody else is doing. So we have a choice as what do we respond to as photographers? Do we respond to the thing that says everybody that we have to photograph in a certain way, that we can't do? This picture of a flower, this is a Jimson weed or datura, wild Jimson weed in California. And it's going, there's a lot of things that people say, well, you might not do. The stamens in the center are in the middle of the picture. I'm actually getting in really close with a wide angle lens. A lot of people are afraid of doing that. And it does. You have a choice. And my choice is to say, hey, I want to respond to what's in front of me. Authenticity, this is, many of you have been out around here will recognize this lichen. Authenticity, living and photographing as close to a personal experience as possible. One of the problems today is that there's a lot of stuff that's not very authentic. And I know that some of you have probably seen, heard this. It's pretty common. You know the term artisanal. And so you see, you go down to the grocery store, and now everything is artisanal. It's this like, or it's this. They put terms on it, handmade and all kinds of stuff to make it seem like it's closer to the artist, so to speak. And that's because the people are looking for authenticity, but when people do that and it's not authentic, and you realize that that's really, the photographer is trying to fool me, the photographer is trying to show me something that's not true, the photographer is trying to pull something over on me, the photographer doesn't really care, then it's not authentic, and it's not getting the same kind of connection with an audience. And again, that personal experience, both of these are things that I care about, close-ups. Lichens are really fascinating organisms. It's always interesting to me about lichens because lichens are not a single organism. They're actually a combination of an algae and a lichen, and a fungus. And they grow together and create these unique forms. And then green herons fascinate me. I don't know why, but they are. And I love to photograph it. I'll try different things. And one of the things that's true to me is I love to show the connection of animals or plants to their environment. And so there's a little bit of reflection, and you can recognize the reflection as a cypress, and it's on a cypress. And the payoff for doing some of this for any photographer is definitely for nature. It's a deeper, richer connection with nature, because if you're connected with it, you're going to be connected, and it's going to be like, oh, this is really cool to be with some of these things. You can be out with a bunch of lubber grasshoppers, which these are immature lubber grasshoppers, and all of a sudden they become interesting. They're not just a bunch of bugs along the side of the trail. There's something that is a life that is a part of the environment, part of the Florida environment. And when you do that too, you're more likely to have a deeper connection with the viewer, because the viewer knows you're connected and can feel that. Some examples, I'm going to take you through some different places. Back up to Minnesota, this is typical of some of the stuff that I like to play with. This is one of the falls up in Gooseberry Falls along the north shore of Lake Superior. And for me, what's important is this is really true to me, is I love to get in tight to a subject like this and just fill up the frame with something and just have a small portion of the frame with something else. So that little bit of trees over there tells you where this is. You don't even have to know everything. You get an idea of where it is because of the cold, the ice, but there's a lot of other things of textures and forms and so forth that are going on there. Here's another one of a waterfall up in the same area on a sunny day with a panoramic shot. Again, to give a feeling of place. For me, a feeling of place is important. That connects me with the location. It connects my photographs with a location. That's important. Not everybody wants to do that, and that's okay if it's authentic for them to do something else. Some of you who know a little bit of my work, I did a book with Art Wolf called The Art of the Photograph. And Art has a little different style. He likes to do, he tends to be a little more graphic design for a lot of his images. And me, I like to be a little more connected. But for both of them, they're authentic. For him and for me, they have authentic approaches. Here's another shot of the water. Authentic again, because it just excites me to get that backlight, that light, creating the sparkle in the water and waiting for that moment. I'm not just capturing a picture of the water. I'm capturing that particular moment because there's this energy of the water, there's this energy of this spray, and then it contrasts with the calm clouds and then the ice that you know the water is going to freeze on. There's a certain energy there. Here's a tighter shot of water exploding over the ice, and again the contrast of the ice and the explosion of the water, which to me is exciting, was interesting, and creating an image to give that feeling of this energy was interesting. But then going off away from the lake, there's a number of things that are near there. This is birch trees, and this is going against a lot of the rules. You hear a lot of people that will say, oh, you know, wide-angle lenses are for big scenes, and you use macro lenses for close-ups and telephotos for birds, okay? Well, you miss a lot when you do that. A lot of times I like to shoot with a wide-angle lens up really close. This is a wide-angle lens up really close to the birch trees. What does that do? It changes perspective, and it changes the size of the background. You can kind of see the trees in the background. The trees are still there. So, I mean, if I shot with a different lens, you wouldn't have that same perspective. You wouldn't see the sky the same. It just gives a different feeling. Another reason I like to do it is that you get this feeling of really this being right up at you, and you're just right there. And that's what that wide angle does. And for me, that's just interesting and exciting, and it connects me with the environment. Now, this is backed off a little bit, obviously, on a different day, a different group of birch trees. And for me, there's still the winter. Although now we live in Southern California, and we joke about this. You guys probably heard the jokes. You know, Minnesota is 11 months of winter and 1 month of rough sledding. Although the one that actually is really true, and I heard somebody say this the other day, is that Minnesota has 4 seasons. It has pre-winter, winter, just after winter, and spring, summer, fall. And that's kind of the way it is sometimes. But that's a part of the environment there. And if I am there, and I do like photographing in the winter, I'm just glad I don't live there anymore, to be perfectly honest. It's the length of the winter that's the problem. But it is fascinating to see the snow, to see the patterns, and to, connect with winter in some way. Here's a patterns. This is using a more abstract kind of a design. This is a patterns of ice on the Mississippi River, shot from a bridge, and just looking at the patterns. And now we're back down in Florida, so we're making a quick change. I love flowers. Flowers have been part of me as more than they're just pretty things to photograph. I actually studied in college plant and soil science because at the time the photography was okay, but where I went to school, in high school particularly, my high school was very academically oriented towards science. And so you were really pushed towards science. And so plant and soil science was kind of a good excuse because at least it kept me out in the environment, and kept me out in nature. And even though I still loved photography, I was photographing then. I actually photographed for the school paper, but my degree was in plant and soil science. So plants are really interesting. And looking at flowers, and this is... actually, I am blanking on this one. This is local. Anybody know this one? No one knows this one? Because I'd be happy to know what it is. I have to find it because I'm not sure what it is. But it's a real pretty flower. It's in some of the areas around here. This actually was shot down. It's called. Some of you may know is it called the Tall Cypress Natural Area? It's down near. It's near. No, that's Grassy Waters. Yeah. This one is down. It's down near the Butterfly World. No, that's over too far. This is actually a real small little natural area that's by Sample Road and Turtle something. any rate, it's an interesting area, and it's an area that's a combination. It's a lot of basically it's mostly cypress, and it's a wet area. This is shot with a very long telephoto lens. I mean, again, you see, people say, "Oh, I have to use a macro." That's not a macro. And the reason why it's done with a really long telephoto lens, I could get closer to these flowers. There's some that are real close to the boardwalk, but this particular one, I love the way it was against this simple background. And the only way to get that simple background was to shoot with a really long telephoto lens. And I love the form of it and so forth. That's using technology for a specific purpose to control the image, to hopefully communicate and to really emphasize the flower. And this actually is grassy waters. And here we have the cypress late in the day, and the sun is getting lower in the water, and actually, lower in the water, lower in the sky. This that looks more neutral. It's not. The actual picture is a little warmer because of that. But you know what's interesting about this to me is that I think this is fascinating. How many of you saw the great show, the National Parks series that Ken Burns did? It was on PBS. A number of you saw that. Okay, one of the things that they said in that is that the Everglades National Park was the first national park that was not preserved for a spectacular landscape, that it was preserved for the wildlife and the birds and so forth, which is fine, except that the Everglades has a really unique landscape. I mean, this is not like every other landscape. It's pretty darn interesting. And many of you may know that the Grassy Waters, the area up here, we are in the Everglades up here. Everglades National Park is only part of the Everglades, and most Florida people know that. I always thought it was fascinating. I had no idea until a number of years ago that the Everglades actually starts up near Orlando, and then it heads south from there. This is the Everglades, not the Everglades National Park, but it is the Everglades, and that's an important landscape. And I think it's great that people like Clyde Butcher have been photographing these Florida landscapes and giving them some prominence. But my fear sometimes is that people just see it as Clyde Butcher's pictures and they don't necessarily see the landscape. And I think it's important to see these landscapes because they are important. It's not just the big West Coast mountains that are important. There are other landscapes that are important as well. Even little details of landscapes. You know, this is in a cypress swamp shot from a boardwalk. And it just gives a different perspective. It gives a different feeling. And these are important landscapes. And this gets to be, I wish it were a little warmer, you'd see it. But this is a very complex image in terms of all the textures and lines and so forth. And I talked about vulnerability. Pictures like this, for any photographer, are very vulnerable because, number one, that's not the expected type of landscape. Most people, you know, landscapes, they expect to see the big, even in Florida, the big skies like Clyde Butcher. And most people who see the landscapes expect to see, you know, like running water. They like to see big trees. They like to see, you know, all kinds of stuff. Not this. This actually goes back to, some of you may be familiar with Elliott Porter. This is more like the work that Elliott Porter did. And I think it's a shame that there aren't a lot of photographers today that are still doing work in his type of work. I don't mean the same, but type. Because he was photographing landscapes that deserve to be seen. And unfortunately, if everybody's photographing landscapes to look like Ansel Adams landscapes or Clyde Butcher landscapes, we're missing other landscapes. And you see, that's where it comes for me, the care for the landscape. You care for those things. You say, hey, I want to share this because I care about it and I want people to see it. Now I'm moving out west to my area. This is out in Southern California. And a lot of people just see Southern California and they see Los Angeles and they say, oh, it's this just big sprawling city. And the city is, but the city is also surrounded by mountains and the ocean. And these are the Santa Monica Mountains, and the projector doesn't want to fully reveal some of the detail that's down there, but this is at dawn, and there's detail in there. This is in the chaparral. The chaparral is a very unique landscape. You know, if I were to ask people about unique landscapes or unique ecosystems in this country, a lot of people would say the redwoods because they're the trees, the deserts because of the cactus. Most people would not say the chaparral. And then there's some people would say the Everglades, although if you get out of Florida, a lot of people don't even recognize that. The Everglades are such a unique ecosystem, such a unique landscape. The chaparral is such a unique, the chaparral does not grow just anywhere. It has a very limited range. Basically, it's in California. And it's only in certain areas in California. And even people in California don't recognize the importance of this landscape as a part of our world and part of the heritage. This is also the chaparral. You can see a little bit along the ground. These are the mountains just outside of Los Angeles. These are the Santa Monica Mountains that are just to the west of Los Angeles. Here's something interesting, how people sometimes miss stuff that's nearby. The Santa Monica Mountains are within driving distance. By driving distance, I'm talking within half an hour to an hour of probably 10 million people. Okay, this particular location where I shot this is a sunrise, and the mountains that are going out in the distance. A beautiful spot, beautiful overlook, easily accessible by road. You do have to drive up a road away from main roads, but it's not bad. There's switchbacks going up into the mountain, but it's all paved. There's no problems to it and stuff. And over the years that I've been photographing this area, the Santa Monicas, I've been photographing them and the chaparral for probably about the last 7 years, because I started doing it seriously after I started working on my own after leaving Outdoor Photographer magazine as the editor. And in all the years that I've been there, and I admit I'm not there every day, I may only be there once a month, but in all the days I've been there at sunrise, I have never seen another photographer there shooting seriously other than somebody I've brought. And what's interesting is I've gone up to Yosemite, and some of you may have been to Yosemite, and I've gone up to Yosemite where literally there have been photographers in line to get a particular angle. That many photographers. And so there are so many opportunities for stuff around. And I think that part of what it is, Yosemite starts becoming photography from the head. I have to be at Yosemite. I have to be here. I have to be there. And saying, hey, what can you find that's exciting, that's interesting around you? Because there are things always around us. And by the way, that looks interesting. People will sometimes say, well, gee, you live near a really exciting place. I'll guarantee you that most of the people in my area do not consider this an exciting place. They've been by it, they've seen it, but they've never been up in it because it's close, it's chaparral, it's not dramatic. There's no big trees of the redwoods, there's no big waterfalls. There's also no big flocks of birds like in the Everglades. It's a beautiful spot, but it's easy to overlook if you don't spend some time in it. This is also in the Santa Monicas. And there's a little area. It's very dry, but although this has a little bit of year-round water in this particular spot. Santa Monica, I came around the bend one time. They had this wonderful clouds, and I loved the clouds, and I loved the chaparral and the way the rocks were coming through the chaparral. Beautiful, beautiful location. I think most people who were at that spot would say, yeah, that's a really great location. And again, photographing from the heart, you can find places if you start, connecting with that location. Like I said, one of the things I like to do is connect my subject with the surroundings. This is a lupin blooming in the spring in the Santa Monica Mountains, and connecting it with that place. Because that's important to me, and if it's important to me, I want to share that, and that's more from the heart than any, intellectual thing. Because I'm not going to say intellectually everybody's going to like that, but I do want to connect people with it. Same thing here. This is prickly phlox blooming in early on, and I'm getting in close, getting in tight to show off them with the background. But I'll also do other things. This is prickly phlox with a macro lens, just playing with color and form. And again, not doing anything because anybody told me I should, or anything that my inner critic is telling me I should, but just exploring because it was fun and because it made me feel good. And that starts connecting with your heart, and I want to share that. Here's a California thrasher up in the chaparral, and again, that really shows the chaparral. That's very typical of it. You've got the bird sitting up in the dead branch, and then the shrub. Chaparral is a shrub-based ecosystem. There are no big trees in it. You'll see big trees in the watercourses along the little streams. Then you'll see big trees, otherwise not. And then just some of the little things. Sometimes little things just fascinate me. This is this flower, it's called a sunflower, but the flower is not very big. It's a San Diego sunflower. It's only about a little bit bigger than your thumb. And so you see the little native bee that's on it. It's very small. And it's just, because I want to explore these things, I want other people to explore these things. And I couldn't resist this. I saw this out in my native plants garden. It's a jumping spider with a fly. and it had caught the fly, and I was able to catch it. It didn't let go of the fly. It was determined to hang on, and so I put it on a white background to simplify it. And you know, sometimes you see things like that. You discover things that can be really exciting when you're open. Because part of photographing from the heart is being open to experience. Photographing from the head is always applying certain things that says it has to be a certain way. Then you're not necessarily open. You know, photographing from the head is starting to plan. This is what I'm after. I'm having this lens. I'm doing this kind of thing. Whereas being open from the heart, as you explore, you say, oh, that's really interesting. What can I do with that? And it's amazing. You see, you know, you could go to Africa and not see any more dramatic struggle of life and death. Jumping spiders are fascinating little spiders. This is in my backyard. Happened to come out and there was a hatch of these little grasshoppers, and I just thought they were funny. And I just started playing with them, and I just moved all around until I found an angle where the one was sharp and the others weren't, and the light was interesting. And here's another native bee. You start, you know, falling in love, like I said, with certain subjects. And the native bees are fascinating, and partly because they aren't as well known. And I say, all right, they're interesting to me, and I want to share that and get people to think about it. So, photographing from the heart, as Teddy Roosevelt said, while daring greatly. And sometimes photographing from the heart means the photographer has to dare greatly. And when I see photographers trying too hard to photograph from the head, and even pros and stuff, you know, then you start to lose audiences, you start to lose yourself. And when you start photographing from the heart, it does mean daring greatly, it does mean being vulnerable. And I think that's important. Just some thoughts if you're interested in some things. My website is a little hard to see, but it's those are two blogs. One of the blogs is www.natureandphotography.com. That is a website that's about nature and nature photography. The other one is www.mirrorlessnature.com. I started shooting mirrorless cameras a little over 2 years ago because I was tired of the weight of the big cameras, and I got rid of all of my big cameras. I don't have any big cameras anymore. I started out with Sony, and then I ended up not really liking, there's some aspects of Sony I didn't like. So I ended up, now I'm in Micro Four Thirds. Micro Four Thirds is Panasonic and Olympus, and they both, and because they both do it, you get this huge range of gear that gives you that flexibility that you may need to get the appropriate technique and the appropriate stuff for the gear. And that's what I'm shooting now. But at any rate, that's what Mirrorless Nature, because I got a lot of questions about it, so I started a blog. And then those are some things. I have a interactive book for the iPad, which is the one on the left, Reports from the Wild. The other three are books from Peach Pit Press. They're ebooks. They're all inexpensive. They're all like, everything up there is less than $5. And Peach Pit Press, you can actually go to Peach Pit Press or go to my website and you'll see links to those. And one is The Power of Color in Nature in Nature and Landscape Photography, The Power of Black and White in Nature and Landscape Photography, and Choosing the Right Lens for Nature and Landscape Photography as well. So if anybody has any questions, if you want to turn up the lights a little bit, I'm happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, thank you for coming, and I hope you think about what it might mean to you about photographing from the heart. There's one. There we go. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I just really want to thank you for kind of reminding us again, inspiring us to sort of look inside for inspiration of what to take photographs of. But I wonder when you said to leave the critic behind, how we would ever improve, and to kind of use your analogy of the skaters. The speed skaters have a discrete endpoint. The figure skaters don't, but there's a combination of subjective, objective, aesthetics that somehow or another they can go against to improve what they do. And how do photographers do that?
You know, that's a really great question, and it's really fascinating because at the Olympics, some of you may have seen the first few days when the team skating, which was a new event, And I don't remember the young man from the U.S. who fell on and which is what a terrible position. He's the first one to skate for the team, and he falls and gets a terrible score. And I mean, that's really tough. And they asked the question afterward. They said, you know, do you think it was the pressure? He said, oh no. Well, what else is he going to say? But it was interesting. The commentary of some of the people talking about the Olympics was that this particular athlete had a reputation for having problems with real pressured events. And you go, okay, as a coach, if you know that, his self-critic, I don't care what he said, his self-critic, and particularly when he saw the Russian skater, you know, what happens, the Russian skater comes up and gets a really high score. And then he comes up, and he's the first skater, okay, and he's got to position the U.S. team, because this is a team event. So he's got to position the team event going, and he falls. Okay, and then he never really fully recovered either. And obviously there's something of that self-critic that's going on inside his head. And then you saw, though, I'm terrible with the names. The couple that did the ice dancing, they're just amazing. You just watch this. How is that even possible to do on ice skates? And yet they're doing it. But there, you know, you watch them, you knew there was no thought about anything other than enjoying and doing their performance. There was no critic going on, their stuff. And my daughter played soccer. She played from when she was a kid all the way through college, and she was a goalkeeper. Now, even if you don't know a lot about soccer, you realize the goalkeeper is where the ball has to get by. And if the ball gets by, what people often blame is the goalkeeper, even though the goalkeeper is actually the last stage. And if they haven't kept the ball from getting close, and one of the problems is sometimes that you run into trouble is that if you have a defense that has trouble controlling the offense, then I don't care how good a goalkeeper you are, you're going to let in goals. That's just the way it goes. So she had to learn for a long time about that. And one of the things that was always difficult, and in thinking about that self-critic, it's easy if you let goals in, all of a sudden your critic can be just killing you. And she had a fellow, another goalkeeper, one of her teammates, who also, they alternated in goal. And this other teammate really had some issues with this. If she was doing well and keeping the ball out, she's great. She'd let something in, and there was a very good possibility she'd let something in again. I don't mean deliberately, but she'd struggle with it because she started thinking too much. That self-critic, it kept her from doing that. The other issue is that if you start watching your coach, and what I mean by that, and that you see it on players on the field, is that they start paying too much attention to what the coach thinks. I'm not saying the coach isn't important, but in other words, they're getting out of the game. Instead of paying attention to the game, part of their attention is over here. Well, the same thing happens as photographers, is if we're starting to put part of our attention out here, part of our attention is on somebody else. I mean, one of the issues, and I could hear this voice in my head. I don't have this right now because I've worked to get rid of it. But my boss, when I was with Outdoor Photographer magazine, was Steve Werner, who was he was the publisher of Outdoor Photographer magazine. And I'd be out shooting stuff, and I'd start thinking, well, geez, I wonder if Steve will like this. Okay, well, so what at that point? He can choose later, but I shouldn't be thinking that as I'm shooting, because all of a sudden I'm limiting myself. Okay, so that self-critic really keeps us from being the best photograph possible, best photographer, and it can be hard. You know, over the years, sometimes I've actually written about this, is that sometimes I've thought to myself, okay, you know, shut up. You just say to that voice inside, shut up. This is not your place. Shut up. Right now, I'm going to be here. But as I've thought about this more, at this point now, I don't know if that always works, because if you just say shut up, it's still there. That voice is still kind of hanging out, ready to come in. And now I'm kind of like, okay, I hear you're there, but you know what? I'm not choosing that direction right now. I'm choosing to do something else. And it's sometimes that calms the voice better. We all get it, some more than others, and some are better able to control it. But I think being aware of that critic, and being aware that it can hurt you as a photographer and keep you from photographing from the heart, is a big start. And then once you're aware of it, you can start saying, hey, I'm going to make a different choice here. I'm going to make a choice to do something that may be against what that self-critic does, because I want to see what happens. I want to see what goes on. So, but yeah, it's great question. The question? Yeah.
You were talking about the equipment taking over the situation. What do you carry when you go?
Well, it varies, but I travel a lot lighter now with mirrorless gear, but typically what I used to actually carry more, but I've simplified it, and I find that now, because I won't think about it a lot, I will shoot, most of my images are probably shot with a 12 millimeter lens. Now, I have to understand what 12 millimeter is on micro four thirds. 12 millimeters on micro four thirds is the same as 24 for 35 millimeter full frame, and for 16 millimeters for, I think, 16 millimeters for APS-C. And that's actually a focal length I've liked a long time, and I've recognized that. And so I say, all right, I want to make sure I have that. So I actually, that was an important consideration, that I had that focal length. I've always liked that focal length, but I don't need wider. I used to have wider. I don't care, because it doesn't. It just simplifies things. And then I have a. This will actually it will maybe drive some of you crazy, but. I have a 300 millimeter lens. It's a Nikon lens. With mirrorless cameras, you can adapt those lenses, and I have an older style lens, which allows me to. It makes it easy to adapt. It also it has manual focus, which. This was something I forgot until I got this particular lens. Is that autofocus lenses are not designed for manual focus. You can use them for manual focus, but they're not designed for manual focus. They don't focus very well in manual focus. Yeah, they focus, but they really don't. If you get an old manual focus lens, you find it's amazing. You just go, wow, this is just amazing. So my 300 acts like a 600. So I have essentially a 600 f4 lens that's this big. And I use that a lot because it's easy to carry. I can carry that with me all the time because it's not huge, it's not big and heavy, and I love the look. And then I don't have a lot in between that I carry. I do have a 50 millimeter macro, which acts like a 100 millimeter macro, but I don't always use that. I have extension tubes I'll use, like that one picture of the flower was shot with a 300. That had extension tubes to allow that lens to focus close up. So I'll take extension tubes. I actually don't even always carry the macro because it's just as an extra thing, because I use the extension tubes. Because I use extension tubes with wide angle with telephoto, and I will probably get something in a mid-range, but that's kind of simple. I do like occasionally playing, and I do have a fisheye lens that focuses really close, and I deliberately found one that focuses within inches because it gives a different look, and I'm just after that particular look. And that's it, to keep it simple. I'm not interested in carrying a lot more. Yeah, in the back? Okay, that's a good question. Now, one of the things that I like to make clear is that I think all camera gear today is great. I mean, everybody makes really great gear. There's great lenses and so forth. I had gone to Sony at the time, and I went to Sony about 2.5 years ago, roughly, because I liked I wanted the tilting LCD. I love a tilting LCD because and there's a technology for me that helps, because a lot of stuff, you may not have noticed, but there's a lot of stuff I'll shoot really low, and it's easier to use a tilting LCD to get low. And today I won't use a camera without that. I actually had, before I had the Sony, I had Canon gear, and I had a 7D, and then I bought a 60D, and I quit using the 7D. And the reason why I quit using it, a lot of people talk about the 7D is a better camera than the 60D, although the 60D has the same sensor and so forth. But I was using the 60D all the time because of the tilting LCD. And even at that time, I was using live view all the time. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But at any rate, the Sony, I started using because, one, I thought I wanted to stay with APS-C because And it has nothing to do with the image quality of the sensor. It has to do with how the focal length relates to depth of field. Because as the smaller formats, in micro four thirds is a little bit smaller, use shorter focal lengths, which means you have more depth of field. That's great if you want more depth of field. I can get depth of field with my camera better than a full frame 35 millimeter sensor because of the size of the focal length for the angle of view. However, I have a harder time getting limiting depth of field because of, again, the focal length. So it's what? So the Sony, well, that was part of it, and at first I liked it, but there was something about it that never quite felt right. And I had an opportunity to shoot with a Panasonic GH3, which is their flagship camera. And the GH3, I fell in love with it. I mean, I just personally, I love the way that it handled. It's a little bit bigger of the micro four thirds, but it's still smaller than the others, than most DSLRs. And the GH3 is designed to be essentially a professional camera. Not that you'd have their G, whatever it is, that's not the same ceiling and the same body and so forth. But what I liked about it is that Panasonic actually paid attention, I think, to how photographers use controls. And Sony didn't. And whereas I talked about the gear, one thing that gear is a problem is if it gets in the way. And if you're constantly dealing with the controls, and the problem with the Sonys is a lot of the Sony is menu-based, and you're constantly going to the menus, and even with a touch screen, you're constantly changing menus and constantly doing stuff. The menus then start to get in the way of the photography, whereas with the Panasonic has all of the controls. Most of the controls are accessible by dials or buttons, and you can even there's 3 buttons that you can set for specific controls, so it's really, really accessible. The other reason why I went with that is because I do a lot of video, and the video the video from the Panasonic GH3 is better than any other DSLR that's on the market today, other than a Canon 1DX. Anything else does not have the video quality, so that's what I think.
You're talking about a Sony that you had 2.5 years ago. So you're not familiar.
Oh, I shot with the Sony for 2 years.
What?
I shot with the Sony for 2 years.
I understand.
Yep.
I said, but you're not familiar then with the newest one, the NEX6.
I haven't shot with that one, but I'm familiar with all the NAXs. I had multiple.
That answers all of the things you just said. I was just wondering if...
From what I've seen of it, it doesn't do everything. There's some things that I just handling it. Also, my feeling, again, there's nothing wrong. I mean, if you have one and you like it, then that's perfect. It's a perfect camera for you. But for me, it was not balanced as well, and the GH3 is better balanced for me. Now, it so happens that another reason I happen to like the Panasonic is because Panasonic and Olympus use the same system. So they use the same lenses and they use the same flash. So now I have a range of accessory possibilities. It's sort of like cable. You know, I've often heard people say, well, I don't have cable because I don't watch TV. I have cable because I don't watch TV very much, because I can get the stuff I really want. And I had trouble with the lenses from Sony because there weren't always the lenses that I wanted, whereas with the Panasonic and Olympus. But that doesn't mean for somebody else that wouldn't be true. But for me, just for me, it gave me a flexibility that I just didn't have in the Sony. So that's why. Okay? All right, so that's it. So if any of you have any questions, we're packing up, and I'm happy to talk to you. But thank you very much.